Hi everyone, it's Kurt, and this is our first video for testing and evaluation in English. And the content today is Chapter 1, Assessment Concepts and Issues. All right, so let's get started. Now, as I mentioned in class, in the videos, I'm going to briefly touch on what I think are the key points of the chapter. And so for you, for any of these that don't totally make sense or you have a little bit more interest, make sure you read in detail in the chapter. And for anything that doesn't make sense, make sure you write your questions down, because I'm going to give time at the beginning of each class for us to discuss any questions on the content. Okay, so as I mentioned in class, the textbook that we are using is Language Assessment, Principles and Classroom Practices. So most of the content today will come from there. All right, so let's get started. Okay, so here we go. This is the rundown of the video. So we're going to look at learning objectives, and then we're going to look at assessment and testing, and then we'll move on to types and purposes of assessment, issues in language assessment, and then to round it all out, we're going to talk about current hot topics in language assessment. Now, the good thing about this textbook is that it's quite new. It was published in 2019. So there will be certain subjects that are maybe a little bit outdated, but the overall theoretical concepts behind everything are going to be quite useful for us. Okay, so let's start. Okay, so the objectives that we're going to look at are some key points, and it's really important that you learn these at the very beginning of our course. So the first one is assessment versus testing, and then we're going to distinguish between 5 types of language tests, and then we're going to connect history and current trends in testing, and then we're going to learn about current issues for researchers. Okay, so all of these things at the end of this video, and when you're done reading the chapter, you should have a very clear idea about these 4 areas. Okay, so let's start. Assessment. So what does assessment mean? Now, assessment is kind of an umbrella term. It covers all of the smaller terms, and it's when you evaluate or judge the level of some attribute of a person. So I'm going to assess your ability in speaking, or I'm going to assess your ability in writing. Okay, so pretty self-explanatory. So how about testing? Well, testing is a subset of assessment. It's one form of assessment. Now, typically by definition, it's a method to measure some kind of result, right? Like you think about your typical test. We measure your ability in something, but you can also measure the performance of the student. You can measure an individual's ability in some skill, and you can also measure a domain. For example, your English proficiency. We're going to talk more about domains later. One of the key points, though, in testing is that when you give a test, you have to make sure you're measuring the correct domain. If you're assessing someone's English proficiency and you give a test that doesn't actually test that, then it's just a waste of time, and actually you haven't really assessed anything. So as I said, testing is a subset of assessment. So remember, assessment is the big umbrella term, and then testing is inside of that. It's just one way to assess. Okay, the next one we're going to look at is measurement. Okay, so what is measurement? So measurement is when you quantify the performance of the learner. You give it an actual number or some kind of descriptive evaluation. So 2 terms that we often use in testing and also in research statistics are quantitative and qualitative data or assessment. So quantitative, very simply put, is when you use numbers. It comes from the word quantity. So a quantitative measurement, you'll give them a score on their test. Qualitative is talking about the quality. So this is some kind of description. It's not number based. Okay, so measurement can ignore the strengths of the performance when rubrics are used. So this is something you have to be very careful about in assessment, is that if you give a rubric and you assess, it's one of the reasons why sometimes I don't like to use rubrics when I assess writing, because once you give 4 categories, actually your student might be good at something else, but it's not really covered in the rubric. And so based on the rubric, they could get a bad score. And that happens vice versa. Maybe they have something that they're really bad at, but you never put that in the rubric. And so they end up with a pretty good score, even though their performance wasn't very good. So you have to be really careful that rubrics cover the important parts of the assessment. Okay, the next one is evaluation. So evaluation takes place when you give value to a performance, and it usually includes some kind of consequence. Like I'm going to evaluate your ability to give information in a job interview. And at the end of the evaluation, I will tell you, did you pass? Did you fail? Something like that. Okay, so as I mentioned down here, how do you have a consequence? Pass and fail are 2 very common ones. Or maybe you can get into the course based on your ability, or you get the job based on your interview. Okay, the next category that we're looking at is assessment and learning. And if you're kind of following along in your textbook, you'll see I'm kind of going by the headings. Okay, so why do we have assessment, right? Well, assessment is something that we need to do, of course, in a classroom environment. But it shouldn't be the be-all, end-all when you give a test. So in class, of course, students should be free to practice. And they should be able to practice without judgment a lot of the time. Now, of course, there's going to be a time when you're going to assess them, but they have to be able to practice first. And they have to be able to practice without fear of making mistakes. And I think that's a thing in a lot of classrooms that is missing. Now, as a teacher, you are always observing and assessing. Even if it's not an actual test, your job is always to evaluate or assess what your students are doing. Maybe evaluate's the wrong word. You're always assessing what they're doing in class, and you should be giving feedback, suggestions, assistance. It's really important in that learning stage that your assessment is more what we call formative assessment. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Okay, so as I put here, formative assessment is another kind where it's actually more qualitative in nature. It can be quantitative as well. Okay, so now we're going to look at informal versus formal assessment. And informal assessment is when you assess without making conclusions. That means there's no pass or fail. They're not going to get the job or not get the job based on the assessment. It's just, I'm going to assess you and I'm going to give you some help or feedback. And it should be non-judgmental in this stage. This is really important because when you let your students practice in class, if you are too judgmental or you make some kind of conclusion every time they do something, you're going to raise their anxiety. Okay, now formal assessment, of course, that's pretty self-explanatory. This is an appraisal of student achievement. And usually these are purposefully designed to assess their specific skills or all their skills or the knowledge that they learned in your class. So here's a good quote that I like from the textbook. It says, all tests are formal assessments, but not all formal assessment is testing. And maybe we'll talk about that as we go on throughout the semester. But when you give a formal assessment, it doesn't mean you have to give them a test, right? There are other ways to assess your students. That's kind of the direction that I will push some of you who are going to be English teachers in the future. You don't always have to have this formal test when you're doing assessment. Okay, so now we're going to get into formative and summative assessment. So formative assessment very basically is you are assessing the students during their process of forming their abilities. So you're assessing them while they're learning. in the classroom, while they're doing group work or while they're presenting, you are assessing the process, not just the final product. So formative assessment is most or all types of informal assessment. You're not giving them an actual test, and you're probably not giving them a score. Now, this we could debate. It's possible to give a test, but just in your mind for now, just think about formative assessment is while the class is happening, you're observing, you're giving feedback, and you're assessing what's happening at that time. So on the other side is summative assessment. And what that means is it's a summary of what they have learned up to a certain point. So these are usually your unit tests, your midterms, your final exams. And the purpose of them is to find out how much they've learned up to that point. Okay, so in terms of language learning, formative assessment has shown superior for student learning and feedback for teachers, which means if you want your students to truly learn, formative assessment is very important in the classroom. And it's also really good for you, the teacher, because when you give formative assessment, you realize very quickly whether your students are doing well or not and why. Why are they struggling? If you only test them at the midterm, at the final, whatever the test system is, then you're going to miss a lot of the why they're struggling. You're just going to get this test and you're going to give them a bad score and you're going to get mad and say, I can't believe you didn't learn the material. But in reality, you're not really knowing why. So probably you will just blame your students for not paying attention or not studying. But actually, it could be your fault as the teacher because you weren't evaluating them as they were learning. Okay. Now, the next one, we have two types of tests. The first one is called norm referenced, and the second is criterion referenced. A norm reference test, you have to think carefully about this, is when the test taker's scores are compared to a relative mean or percentile rank. So it's not about the class average, it's about an average that you should get to if you're trying to get into university or you're trying to prove your English proficiency is good enough, something like that. So you know all of these type of exams, TOEFL, TOEIC, GPT, the SATs, GRE, any exam like this, which we call like a standardized exam, and they're used all over the world and thousands of people take them. So when you get your results, you don't really get a percent. They'll give you a score, and then that score relates to some kind of ranking. Okay, the second is called criterion reference tests. These are designed to give test takers feedback in terms of a score based on course objectives. So these are your classroom tests. You give the students a percent, or you give them an A or a B, something like that. So for us in this course and for English teachers, we are much more worried about criterion reference tests because this is how we're going to assess language in a more practical way. Okay, so in the textbook, they talk about some different types and purposes of tests. I'm going to very briefly run through these. So again, if you want more details about them, I think a lot of them are self-explanatory. Make sure you read very carefully in the textbook. So the first one is an achievement test. So again, you're trying to test your students based on some particular achievement, some skill, something like that. The second one is a diagnostic test. And a diagnostic test is a little bit different in that this type of test will assess what you need help in or what thing is not good enough. So it's kind of the opposite of an achievement test that will test what you're good at. This will test what you're maybe not as good at. And so we give these kind of tests to figure out, okay, I'm going to teach you English. What are you weak at? And that's what we're going to work on. Okay, the third one is a placement test. So, schools, jobs, they will give these to see what level you can go into. Cram schools may do this when you first go there. They give you some kind of test, say, oh, you got 10%, you're going into the beginner class. Okay, then we have proficiency test. I think you know that one very well, how well your proficiency is in the whole language or maybe some specific skills as well. And then we have what's called the aptitude test. Now, these are a little bit outdated. They were very popular in the past. And what they do is they assess your ability to learn a foreign language. But to be honest, these are they're not used very much anymore because they're not really supported by research. And to be honest, it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what your aptitude is. Anyone can learn a foreign language with time and usage of the language. Just like if you're a student in Taiwan and maybe you're not very good at school, you can still become fluent in your native language, right? Foreign language is the same. Okay. And one point I wanted to make about all these tests is sometimes the line between the different types is blurred. Like achievement and diagnostic, even though they're different, there's a lot of similarities between the types, even though the purpose may be a little bit different. Placement test, proficiency test, there's a lot of similarities as well. Okay, so now we're going to move on to a little bit of history. And again, I'm going to go through this quickly. It's kind of like in teaching methods. If you want to know why a certain teaching method is used now, you should go back and look at the past and see how do we get here? What were the problems in the past? So the first section in this part is the behavioral influences on language testing. So in the past, when we were using the grammar translation method and that type of thinking, we used what's called the discrete point test. And these are tests that we believe you could break all of the skills of language into separate parts. Like here's a listening section, a speaking section, a writing section, a reading section. And maybe they had multiple choice questions, kind of like what we still do today. But the problem with that is actually can't break a language into one specific skill, right? Like if I give you a listening test, how can I really assess listening only? It's impossible. It's something that happens internally. Now, I can ask you to give me I can give the student some kind of comprehension question, right? But there's some problems with that as well, because maybe the student can really comprehend, but maybe their speaking is not good enough, or maybe they're nervous. I give a listening test with multiple choice questions. Now it becomes reading as well as listening. So it's really difficult to break them into separate skills, even though we still try to do it all the time. And at this time, we have something called psychometric structuralism. And we're going to talk about this in the next chapter or the chapter after that. We can actually evaluate the tests for things called validity, reliability, and objectivity. And we're going to talk about all of those in the future. But basically, if you're running a test and you want to know whether it is valid, there are ways to evaluate it now because of this time period. Okay, then we moved on to more integrative approaches. So what we started to realize as we started to try to make classrooms more communicative based, not just about learning the grammar and the vocabulary, but we want our students to learn how to use the language. We also wanted our tests to reflect the communicative nature of the language. And so we realized, or they realized, that discrete point tests, they're inauthentic. A multiple choice test is very inauthentic, right? It's not how we use language. So there became this focus on communication, authenticity, context. And they realized that language competence is all the skills working together, not separated into the 4 skills. And so they created something called the unitary trait hypothesis, which means you had to test the skills all together. Unfortunately, it didn't really become a proven theory in research. So this is not something that we talk about anymore. But the idea about testing language use instead of the individual skills, this is something that we continue on today. And At that time, two types of tests that were used were closed tests and dictation. Now, both of these we're going to talk about in future chapters, but probably closed test, you take a paragraph, you try to find an authentic paragraph of writing from somewhere, magazine, newspaper, textbook, doesn't matter. And then as a teacher, you delete every 6 or 7 words. And then you give it to students and ask them to fill in the blanks. Now, the theory behind it is if their proficiency is good enough, they will be able to find a word that fits meaning and grammar. And then dictation is I say something and you listen and write it down. So it tests your listening, it tests your vocabulary knowledge, tests your grammar because you have to know whether to add S or ED on the words, and it tests your writing as well, spelling, all of those skills. Okay, and then moving along, once we realized we wanted our test to integrate the skills together, we started to test more about communicative language. And so at this time, we start to talk about communicative competence. What does it mean to be a successful communicator when you're using English or using a language? So we have communicative test tasks. So actually doing a role play or a job interview or something like that, and then being assessed on it. So what they're trying to do is make a connection between the language test performance and the language use. Now, a lot of times I've seen where teachers give tests and maybe it's a speaking test, but the speaking is all paper and pencil and they're testing their grammatical knowledge. That's not a speaking performance test. It doesn't match. Okay, and then in our textbook, they talk about Bachman's model of language competence. So when we're talking about actual language competence, there are a few things that are included. And the first is organizational competence. So this is your grammar and textual competence, discourse competence, things like that. So are you able to accurately use the language? And can you use the language longer than just one sentence? Are you able to connect thoughts together into long stretches? Are you able to participate in a conversation? And then the second one is pragmatic competence. So in pragmatic competence, they break it into 2 parts. Illocutionary, which means the function. So why do we use language? Are we able to do things like ask a favor, or are we able to borrow something while using the language? And the second is social linguistic. Social linguistic competence is based on culture, context, who you're talking to, and using the appropriate language based on the situation. And we'll talk about these more later. Now, when we're talking about communicative competence, other models will also include strategic competence. If there's communication breakdown, do our students have the ability to keep the conversation going, or are they able to find those words? So actually, a communicative language test will test this type of information, not just something simple. Okay, now in the book, they compare what we call a traditional assessment with an alternative assessment. I'm not going to go through all these. You can look at it on your own. What I wanted to talk about is you have to be careful with stuff like this, because in the textbook, and the textbook talks about this too, they say that obviously when you look at this, they're really painting alternative assessment in a beautiful light. And they're saying, oh, traditional assessments are so bad. I mean, look at this. It's one shot, standardized, continuous, long-term, timed, multiple choice, untimed, free response, and so on and so on. Now, we're going to talk about this a lot in class. Traditional assessments have their place, and alternative assessments also have their place. It's all about the purpose, why are you doing the test, and what are the goals of the course that you're teaching. There probably should be a mix of both, because in reality, a traditional assessment is much more practical. It's easier to run. Alternative assessments, they take more time, they're harder to score, so they all have to be used based on the right context. Okay, moving on to issues in language assessment, then and now. And the next one is performance-based assessment. So this has actually become quite popular in recent years. What we know is that standardized tests, they do not assess performance. And so if you want to know if somebody's really good at a language, what's the best way to know? You see them use it. And that's kind of what performance-based assessment is. And when we look at performance-based, what we see is that the lines between formal and informal, they start to become blurred because you're not doing a paper and pencil test. One example would be if you're in science class. Instead of giving your students a test and asking questions about an experiment, you get the students to really do the experiment. So you get to watch the whole process and you get to see the final product. And so you can assess them based on all the things that happen in the experiment, and you can give them feedback on every part. So if they fail, maybe they still get a good score because it could have just been one small part of the experiment they did wrong. So as a teacher, it's a little bit informal because there's no paper test, but it's still formal because you're assessing them and giving them a grade. So it's kind of mixed together. And this is where task-based assignment comes in. And those of you who were in my class last year, we talked about task-based teaching. And so we're going to talk about that for sure in this course. But basically, it's using real-life language in order to test your students' ability. Okay, then the next one is dynamic assessment. So a dynamic assessment is a little bit different and it's a little bit complicated, but basically what you're doing is you want to know how well a student can respond to assistance when they're being assessed. So if they get stuck, does that mean they fail? Or can you give them a little assistance? Can you ask them some questions? Can you give them another task, another activity? Can you give them some feedback? Ask them to do some reflection. So actually, in this way, what you're doing is scaffolding the student's ability or knowledge while they're being assessed. Now, this is something that I haven't done a lot of in the past, but it's a very interesting topic and something that we can look at this semester. Okay, another hot topic is assessing pragmatics. Pragmatics is its own subject, but pragmatics is basically the use of language. And in the past, most courses, most teachers, they focus on speech acts. So speech acts are apologizing, making a request, refusing a request, and so on. Different functions of language. But some other things that maybe we should include in our assessments would be the student's success in extended discourse, so actually talking for longer stretches, or their use and understanding of formulaic expressions, and implicatures. Now, implicatures are very simply put like this. If I walk into the classroom and I say to you, "Oh, I'm really hot." Now, as a listener, you may ask yourself, what did I mean? Now, am I trying to tell you that I'm hot, so please turn on the air conditioner? Am I trying to complain about the weather in Taiwan? Am I talking about my personal appearance? No, I'm not talking about my personal appearance, obviously. So that's what an implicature is. It's when you say something, but your meaning is indirect. Sarcasm is another type of implicature where you say something that you don't mean. So you have to know what the real intended meaning is. So when we're assessing students' ability in pragmatics, maybe we need to include these things as well because those are real uses of English. Okay, the next one is the use of technology in testing. So since this book was published 4 years ago, which means it was probably written at least 5 years ago, anything to do with technology will be a little bit outdated. But obviously, when we use technology, there are some really interesting things going on, and we're talking about testing. So right now we have something called a computer adaptive test, which if you take the test online, you start to get questions wrong, the level will become easier. And the more questions you get right, the level will get harder and harder. So that's something we can look at. Another area is corpus linguistics. So since there are so many samples of authentic language out there on the internet, we can use those for our tests. And then of course we have speech and writing recognition software, and there are those type of software. I know Cool English is one website, and I know you must know more than me about the different websites, but where they have you say something in English and then they give you a score based on your pronunciation. Now, obviously, using technology for testing has many advantages and disadvantages, and that's something we're going to talk about this semester as well, because, you know, an advantage would be if I use Google Forms to do my test. Oh, it's so easy for me because I can put all the questions online, students take the test, it scores it for me, and you can also get your score right away. So that's very efficient. What's a disadvantage? Well, students can cheat, right? I mean, if you do anything online, even if you're watching them, you can't watch everybody all the time. And there are lots of other disadvantages as well. If we use technology for testing, then you're interacting with Siri or some other form of AI. Now we're losing the human interaction, and it may not be very authentic. So lots of things to look at in this area. Okay, now at the very end here are some assessment principles, and we're going to really focus on these throughout the whole semester. So if you use assessments in an appropriate way, these are the things that can happen. You can actually increase the motivation of your students, and you can confirm their progress. Remember, that's something that everybody needs when learning a language. When you start to feel like you're not getting better, you need someone to help you confirm that actually you are getting better, and assessment can do that. It can aid in reinforcement and retention of information. Of course, you're taking a test or you're having an assessment, so that will help you to learn. It's called washback. It can reveal someone's strengths and weaknesses, and also it gives closure, right, to a unit or section. I've taken my test, now we can move on to something new. It also promotes student autonomy. It encourages students to set goals, and appropriate assessment can evaluate the effectiveness of the course and the teaching method. So as a teacher as well, you use your assessments in order to assess your own ability in teaching and how your class went. All right, everybody, that's the end of chapter 1. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, if you have any questions at all about the content of the chapter or from the video, make sure you write them down and bring all your questions to class next week. Take care. See you next time. Bye-bye.